For the second year in a row, Sony will not be showing new TVs at CES. Should we be worried? Absolutely not. And I'm not just gonna tell you why, I'm gonna show you how Sony's 2024 TVs are gonna be lit, literally. Welcome back everyone, I'm Caleb Dennison and I've been waiting to show you this video for a little over 6 weeks. Doesn't sound like a long time, but for me, it's felt like an eternity. I think this is pretty exciting stuff. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and I think you will, because today I get to share with you that after years of keeping its LED and mini LED backlight technology and how it works a very closely guarded secret, Sony has finally brought it out of the darkness and into the light. I'm sorry, I really am. I can't help myself sometimes. Anyway, the story goes that in November, Zeke and I traveled to Tokyo to take part in a very small press trip hosted by Sony, along with some other notable characters such as Vincent Teo, John Archer, Rasmus Larson of Flat Panels HD fame, Kate Kozach, and Jake Kroll. There was a little sightseeing, a lot of food, but most of our time not spent on a bus, or this 10 minutes we spent on the bullet train, was spent at Sony's headquarters, where we got to go behind the scenes and learn a ton about what Sony is up to and how Sony does what it does. Now, some of what we learned on that trip is still hush-hush, so it'll have to wait for a future video. But Sony recently told me that we could take the wraps off what we learned about Sony's backlight technology and what it means for 2024 Sony TVs. So I'm gonna do a little show and tell around that in just a bit. But before I do, let me talk a little bit about why Sony isn't showing up at CES with new TVs. Some of what I'm about to share comes from personal observation and, well, let's just say it stems from my experience in the industry. First, let me unequivocally dispel the myths that have circulated about Sony being in some kind of trouble or otherwise struggling. I'm here to tell you, Sony is doing just fine. Look, I don't want to get too inside baseball with you here, but back in 2015, while Sony was still clawing back from the devastating effects of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the resulting tsunami, among some other challenges, then Sony Electronics president Mike Fasulo told me that Sony was going to lean hard into premium. This was kind of big news at the time because Sony, once a household name in TV, had obviously taken a hit from new competition coming out of South Korea, notably Samsung and LG. At that point, it became clear that Sony was going to stop chasing market share dominance and instead was going to turn its attention to capturing and holding a dominant chunk of the premium TV space. And it has. TV enthusiasts know this. Sony's TVs routinely win lots of Editor's Choice Awards and shootouts. This all-premium approach is a big part of why the so-called Sony tax exists. Actually, you know, I made a whole video about this, so I'll just link to that if you're interested, right up there. The point is, Sony is holding its own in the US TV space, and Sony Electronics ain't hurting at all. I mean, even if it was hurting in the TV space, Sony's camera division could probably make up for it. So no, despite the rumors that you may have read online, Sony is not showing up to CES the way it used to because it's on the struggle bus or something. Actually, the reason Sony has changed its approach to CES is, well, for us consumers, it's a little bit boring, honestly. See, Sony is a huge corporation, and they're doing a lot of interesting work in mobility. Their whole CES 2023 press conference was titled Moving People Forward, and this car that they're making in partnership with Honda was the central fixture. Speaking of, I saw the SUV version of that car in Tokyo, and it was freaking awesome. And then there's Sony Pictures, Sony Imaging. They're forging all these partnerships. Sony has a lot of divisions and a lot of coals in the fire. Anyway, what I'm told is that Sony sees CES as an opportunity to talk some big picture corporate stuff while it's got this bright spotlight on the global stage that is CES. It gets one of the world's loudest microphones for about an hour, and they're gonna use that strategically. Like I said, for me, and I assume for you, this is kind of boring. I would rather see fancy new TVs and get excited for what's coming later in the year. But here's the other thing. CES is a loud, noisy place. And I don't just mean it's physically loud, though it definitely is. No, when I say noisy, I mean the massive volume of news and videos and tech media coverage coming out of CES is just insane and overwhelming. It's hard to keep track of all the news coming out of that show. It's fun to watch and talk about, I mean, that's why we go, but there's so much information coming out of there that for any company, it's kind of a crapshoot whether what you say is going to get noticed by the people that you want to notice. Why not then have your own special press event for TVs or cameras or whatever? Have that a couple of months later when there's very little tech news going on and you can basically own headlines for days. I mean, that's just smarter. And taking that idea of skipping the rush hour traffic a step further, why not release your TVs a little later in the year when you're likely to make a bigger splash and own media coverage during that time? Again, it's pretty smart. It's a little annoying for some of us, sure, but from a business perspective, pretty smart. So long as you don't lose sales by coming out with product later in the year. And so far, it seems like that hasn't been a problem. I don't know, we'll have to see how 2024 works out. But how do you feel about that? So that's what's up with Sony's business. Now, what kind of business have they been up to with their LED TV backlighting? Well, if you followed my TV reviews over the years, you have heard me say repeatedly that what Sony has always told anyone who asks for specs and details on their backlight systems is, it's not the number of zones or the number of LEDs you use, it's how you use them. And I would ask Sony, okay, I'll accept that, but tell me how you use them that's different. And of course, they wouldn't say. But as frustrating as it may be to hear that sidestepping sort of non-disclosure answer, for the most part, Sony has done a pretty great job of achieving high performance results with seemingly less dense backlight systems with fewer dimming zones. There have been a couple of exceptions, like I wasn't a huge fan of the X90K, for instance, but for the most part, Sony has done a lot more with a lot less than its competitors. I don't think Sony is going to start disclosing how many mini LEDs and how many dimming zones are at work in their TVs. But now, for the first time ever, Sony is showing us how its backlight tech works. No more, well, it's a little eye of newt and a little toe of frog, and then bam, that's our secret sauce. For this demo that I'm showing you right now, Sony literally peeled back the layers so we could see for ourselves. And that's what you're seeing here. This is not a simulation where what you see on the right side of this prototype screen is a representation of what the backlight is doing. What you're seeing is the actual backlight in action. Sony dissected and peeled back screen layers so we could watch what it does, and so that we could see how it was improved over the already great X95L TV. What you're seeing here is a result of Sony taking the whole idea of a backlight system back to the drawing board. Sony told me that it's developed a new integrated circuit driver that is so tiny it can be housed within smaller clusters of mini LED backlights. Think of it this way. Sony's Cognitive XR processor, the one we all rave about, right? Its job is to take a video signal, break it up into a bunch of different parts, and then send instructions on what to do to the LED section of the panel and the LCD section of the panel. For the backlight system, those instructions are just a bunch of data. In order for the instructions to be carried out, that data has to be analyzed and turned into an analog electrical signal, which then gets routed to the appropriate LEDs or mini LEDs. The execution of the processor's instructions is carried out by a driver IC or integrated circuit. Well, actually, many driver ICs. Now, what Sony is saying is that it's made a driver IC so small that it can instantly increase the number of zones in its TVs without giving up on super fine control. And it's in that fine control that we discover the next big difference that's always been in play on Sony's TVs. What makes Sony's new backlight system work so precisely is the number of dimming levels that it can assign to its backlights. Some TVs just turn the backlights on or off. That's it. Technically, that's still local dimming, but it doesn't fit the commonly understood sense of the word dimming, right? Like at home, if your lights are dimmable, that means that they aren't just on or off, you can set them at different brightness levels between off and on, like 10% or 20% or 60% and so on. Sony exerts more levels of gradation of brightness in its LED backlights than most of its competitors. And this new driver tech it's developed allows it to continue doing that, but at a much larger scale. So if the challenge before was Sony didn't want to give up this granular dimming control just for the sake of having more zones, well, now they can do that. They can keep that dimming control and have more zones. And that's what makes it possible for you to kind of see what's happening in the picture here, even though what we're seeing is basically black and white grayscale. And it's not at the pixel level, not quite pixel level, but man, it looks really close. If we could kind of bundle up Sony's magic with backlight control, that would be it right there. You have lots of different levels of gradation of the dimming, and now it's going to be deployed across way more zones than it ever has been before. Oh, and bonus, it consumes less power, which means it'll skate by EU regulations more easily while still capable of achieving awesome brightness. And blooming, halo effect? I just don't think it's going to be part of the conversation that much longer. That doesn't mean that mini LED TVs are just going to start steamrolling OLED. There are still inherent issues with LCD screens, but man, it's going to get mighty close, and it's still going to be cheaper to produce than OLED. Speaking of peak brightness and nits, Sony isn't talking about what we can expect its new flagship mini LED TV of putting out, but I will point to the fact that Sony just developed a 4,000 nit professional mastering monitor, a tool that Hollywood just hasn't had before. And Sony's all about being able to replicate as closely as it can in its consumer TVs what its professional mastering monitors can do. So, I mean, we'll see. Now, to be clear, I'm kind of taking Sony at its word here, as far as the how and the why behind its backlights. Sometimes technical explanations are really just marketing words to make things sound good on paper. What really matters is what things look like in the real world. But based on what I saw from this prototype and how much better it was than the X95L, I think this is legit. Look, I feel pretty confident that at least some of Sony's 2024 mini LED TVs are going to be extremely impressive. Everything we've loved about Sony TV performance, just better than before. And not a moment too soon, because I know what Samsung, TCL, and Hisense are coming out with this coming year. Fortunately, I do think Sony is going to be able to hang with the real-world content, but man, you guys, I'm a little worried about the specs wars, because Hisense and TCL, they are going to post up some specs numbers that will blow your mind. And for those who judge TVs based on the specs that are printed on a piece of paper, well, it seems like Sony is going to have to lean on its reputation pretty hard. Fortunately, that rep is pretty strong right now, so could work out. As usual, the proof is in the pudding. We'll have to see how it plays out. But I, for one, am pretty thrilled that Sony has started pulling back the veil, and I was honored to be part of the small crew of folks who got to see it. So that's what we can expect from Sony's mini LED TVs, and I think that we can expect the standard LED backlit TVs will improve in lockstep with the mini LEDs. They always have. So then, what about OLED? Well, Sony didn't say anything about OLED TV tech specifically on this trip, not about the OLED panel part. But I will just prepare you now for the idea that Sony may not have a successor to the A95L in 2024. I just don't think that Sony would be able to do anything meaningfully different in a new 2024 model. So the A95L may stick around into 2025. I don't know. We'll see. I do think there will be new OLED TVs, and I think the mid-tier OLED TVs are going to get some pretty fancy new features. Actually, many of Sony's TVs will. But that info, well, you're probably going to have to wait until May of 2024 to find out more. For now, that's what I've got for you on Sony TVs. I do hope you enjoyed it. Thanks as always for watching, everyone. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one, and until then, here's 2 other videos I think you might like.